Hey, good afternoon or good evening, folks. If it's evening for you, welcome to weekly live stream, Neurofeedback and Chill, where we talk about something about the brain. We sometimes do neurofeedback live, although tonight I'm not set up for it. So you can watch earlier live streams if you want to see me do some neurofeedback, both HEG and EEG. But tonight I thought we'd talk about meditation a little bit. A cool study came out that sort of sparked the question, how much time does it take to change your brain with meditation? How much meditation does it take to change your brain? So, and does it make different changes across time? And I've taught this topic in terms of healthy brain aging and ways of digging in and taking control of brain health in the past. But with this new study, I thought it was worth revisiting. And I don't think I've taught it on YouTube. I think you guys are getting a novel talk tonight in this Neurofeedback and Chill. As I always have audio and visual, let me see. I see some questions coming in. Verify you guys can hear me. Hey, Tony Ramos. It doesn't take much, and that's a bad thing the way some people use it, boosting theta. Oh, neurofeedback? I mean, meditation. It can, yeah. That can be one aspect of it. I see Radar's here. Hey, Doc. You're nice to see you, Radar. I'm guessing my audio is okay because you guys would have told me. Let me pull up my notes. You can hear me? Thanks. Appreciate it. Cool, cool. You never know. I never know until, 5 minutes in. But I think this computer setup is pretty good for sitting and talking to you guys. I still have to get my training machine a bit more sorted, but as I do that, I will be putting wires back in my head. But you've got like a year's worth of me doing neurofeedback, so please, if you're wondering what neurofeedback is, which is one of the primary things I use to help people change their brain, go back and watch an earlier video. Radar's got a question. My friend had a mental breakdown after meditating. Oof, fixed it with neurofeedback. Well, I'm glad your friend got some support from neurofeedback. Meditation can be a little bit risky, yeah. There's definitely some, not contraindications, but there's phenomena where neurofeedback will make regulation worse. Like you're not going to meditate your way out of anxiety generally, because that's a concentrated practice, not a relaxation practice. There's a lot of misconceptions about what meditation is. I have a whole perspective on the different flavors and types of meditation: single point awareness, present time awareness, feeling tone awareness. I actually didn't link that study or that article in the show notes, but I'll add it later, and I do have it on my website. That's the sort of technical side in terms of how to do it, and the big takeaway there, I would say, for many people, is that meditation, at least those people who aren't familiar with meditation, is that meditation is not an act of relaxation. It's an act of anchoring, an act of concentration, where you're, to paraphrase, you're I think it's John Kabat-Zinn, but I could be wrong, paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, to the present moment. And then I would add a replacing judgment or evaluation with a bit of curiosity, which can really help with holding some awareness, some open awareness of the moment you're in, and different flavors of meditation, different styles of meditation, which do have slightly different effects, both subjectively and in the literature. They're all essentially about how you are anchoring your attention. And often when people ask me, what meditation practice should I start? How should I meditate? I'll give them some basic tutorials and ways to start if they wish. But I sort of will suggest that an advanced meditator, or somebody for whom this is not a new practice, it's not really about the modality that you're using specifically within the anchor. It's really the practice of it. And so your ability to continue to practice and continue to take anchored control over your resources internally, I think, is the process, the rep of meditation. You get distracted from that anchor, you bring your attention back, your awareness, your perspective back to that way of anchoring again and again and again. over time, you develop stillness and spaciousness within your mind as a function of meditating, perhaps the same way you might become strong by going to the gym, by lifting weight. But you're not strong while doing it. You're not strong while lifting weight. You're feeling kind of weak. That's kind of the point. Later on, you have strength. While meditating, you don't feel generally all that spacious unless you're really rather advanced. You feel distracted and hungry and curious and pain, knees in pain, and other stuff are happening. So, if that's really in the way for you, one good way around that defeating your ability to meditate is to use a moving meditation. Things like yoga, tai chi, even walking can become very powerful meditations if you use the meditative anchor, in that case, of the movement. So there's the awareness of the environment, but also with yoga, you can use eye direction, moving with the breath, moving with the body, etc. So those are very powerful if you have trouble anchoring in a more simple, sitting on a cushion way. But the anchor itself, I think, is a little bit irrelevant to the conversation tonight, even though it can really help facilitate different people's experiences and even maybe have a different quality one to the next. It's not the more nuanced topic I wanted to talk about tonight. So, Tony Ramos, grats, wow, and anxiety makes sense. Okay, thanks, yeah. All right, so let me bring up my notes here. So I used to teach the work of Dr. Sarah Lazar, and when she was a grad student and then moved into her own sort of PI lab work, I was teaching as a lecturer at UCLA, courses including ones on brain aging. And there was a section on interventions, a couple of weeks on interventions that I built out, part of my young biohacker days, thinking of interventions. Anti-aging and biohacking are really close cousins. There's a lot of overlap there in terms of many of the biohacking interventions we use, biohacking, are in some ways anti-aging strategies and or even compounds, things like citicoline, for instance, CITI-choline or CDP-choline. That's an anti-aging medication that's now used by biohackers to improve myelination and processing speed. But meditation apparently will also do those things. And Dr. Lazar's early research showed that you have a cortical thinning with age, which we know. I forget the total percentage. I didn't pull it up for today's study, but it's something like a 1 or 2% per year thinning, especially in the lateral cortices involved with body awareness and feeding and a bunch of other stuff in the insula, the dorsolateral areas. This is sort of pretty significant thinning, and it can get as high as like 10, 20, 15, 30% of that tissue over a decade or two. And that does produce changes in executive function, body awareness, food perception, etc. So it's a very obvious target. Scientists often look where the keys might have been dropped first. In this case, the light was shining on something that was pretty good to see because we know that body perspective changes. We know the insula thins out a fair amount. So she looked at these areas across age and found that there was a very significant sparing effect. That looks like the amount of meditation you do lifelong is very strongly correlated to the sparing of the cortical thinning. So you sidestep that age-related thinning process. And the results were pretty staggering. You take someone who's 50, 60 years old and their brain has the sort of thickness relative to population of someone who's 20 or 30. So very, very large perspective. And when you think about anti-aging, especially, there's this perspective of compression of morbidity, of taking illness and difficulty in function and pushing it back deeper into life. You slide into the grave looking good into the last moment, and then the machine wrecks. You don't want to age for 30 years. And that's what we may be seeing here. If you can take features of cortical thinning and push them back by 20 or 30 years, then you're suddenly at the end of natural human lifespan as we, understand it. The average is around 77, 78 in the US right now. And, we tend to start having cognitive difficulties around 75, even in healthy aging a little bit. And they're not profound, and not everything declines. And Alzheimer's and things is not necessary. You don't have to have those things happen. Like all aging is not, dementia, for instance. But there is this pretty significant ability to sidestep the cortical thinning with meditation. And if you add 30 years, you're suddenly, up above a century. And if you can maintain the facilities, the cortical facilities, for an extra 20 or 30 years, then that really gives you a tool to manage this resource of the brain's health, the cortical thinning, the cortical, cell density. This is something you seem to be able to maintain with a tool robust enough to do all of the work you need done, at least in that general feature of tissue, thinning and aging. So that's kind of interesting. Let's see. Let me answer some questions before I dig more into the meditation. Ryan. Hey, Ryan. Nice to see you. Do you ever see patients experience worsening of symptoms that you're trying to fix by training too much too often? I do. I'll get into that a bit more. Even if the protocol otherwise helped them before, any idea what's going to happen? Yeah, so you can get a worsening for a protocol that either should be good or is good because it's worked for them before. There's a couple reasons. One is the protocol that worked well before may have been working for a need that has changed. That's a reasonable, plausible, 6 months ago you're working in one way, and now if you go back to that particular protocol, you might not need it. That's less likely. More likely is that you fatigue out the resource. You train too many times in a row in the same resource, and it just tires out. And so it's a good idea to only do a couple, 2 to 8, but within person that can really vary. You might have done too many sessions in a row. Another reason is you might have made a mistake. You might have flipped the ears, not known it. You might have, some other small error that can do something, throw you off. It can interact with things sometimes. Neurofeedback can interact with new medications or hyperbaric medicine, other interventions. Those can all create more, variable change. So one of those maybe, yeah. Any thoughts on maintenance sessions like once a month or something like that once a patient's achieved their optimal state since they were going for, or is this normally unnecessary? It's normally unnecessary because most of the things we work successfully on are regulatory features that are self-maintaining. Your attention, your stress, your sleep, in broad ways, your speed of processing. These features are largely balanced in a place of efficiency and don't love to change. Threat sensitivity or attention management. They like to kind of regulate in a way and regulate that way all the time. And so once you get your brain far enough, it tends to practice pretty well. I find that to be very true of most broad resources and most big complaints like ADHD and anxiety. I find that for people with seizure disorders and sometimes migraines, certainly seizure disorders, there's usually a good, year later, a pushback of the seizure phenomena a little bit. Not as much as, usually it's some awareness of it returning more than a true strong incidence. And a little more neurofeedback will seem to be sufficient in those people. And migraines, depends on why. Might see vascular stuff with seasonal things or altitude that may remain triggers. And you can do palliative neurofeedback sometimes for those sorts of things. And there are people for whom their resources are really, really, difficult, impaired, problematic. Pick your adjective. Lots of long COVID can take a long time because fatigue is so easily triggered that you can overtrain easily, and you got to kind of be very cautious doing a lot, and you may need a lot if you have a lot of resources thrown off, or someone who's got nonverbal autism might need months of training, or schizophrenia, or a lot of TBIs or something. So brains are really complex, and individuals have lots of needs, and sometimes you got to kind of go easily. But I don't think maintenance sessions are usually needed. Either you train till you eventually get to where you need, or or you sort of keep working until you figure it out, and then you're there. Not everyone can finish everything they need done in a round of 3 or 4 months. But I would say like 60, 70, maybe more percentage of people will make sufficient change in that 3 to 4 months to have their needs largely met. And then those people with more metabolic things like post-COVID or concussions, et cetera, might take double that time, to really stabilize where they want. But I don't generally see a lot of wear off, even with those people, once you've done enough. Kind of long-winded answer there, but I hope it was useful. Hey, Jehan, regarding cortical thinning, is there any evidence that we can reverse the thinning with neurofeedback for meditation or meditation, thinking neuroplasticity? There's probably a little bit of evidence. I don't think it's well fleshed out, no pun intended. But I would argue there's a very strong rationale for it helping both neurofeedback and meditation. Also, some nutritional interventions, some new fatty acids that seem to get into the brain pretty thoroughly. LPC, DHA, LPC, EPA compounds like Lysaveta as a brand name are pretty exciting. Again, CDP choline, pretty exciting because it triggers that remyelination and changes how cells use choline. So it's affecting the phospholipid bilayer, of course. So there's some interesting compounds that seem to make the brain fat and happy. And if I was concerned about cortical thinning, I would probably be ramping up my LPC DHA and my citicoline. Again, I speak fast, so that's not acetylcholine, it's citicoline, C-I-T-I choline, or Charlie David Paul, CDP-choline. This is an old anti-aging compound that I mentioned earlier. By the way, just because I'm mentioning compounds, this is not medical advice. Do your own research, talk to your doctors. But CDP choline can be a little bit activating. Don't take it in the afternoon or evening. Maybe don't take it every single day because the elimination half-life is longer than 24 hours. And if you get too cholinergic, too dominant in the cholines, and you build it up too rapidly, you will often get a little irritable or have some disrupted sleep, some nightmares or things. So watch for that. Back off. Take it fewer times throughout the week, in the morning only generally. But it's a pretty interesting compound and very well tolerated and used by elders as well as, a study drug for college students without too much downside as far as I can tell. So back to meditation, unless there's more questions here. Here we go. Great question, Jehan. What benefits, actually this is Tony Ramos, what benefits distinguish meditation from neurofeedback? Thanks. The benefits are more broad, I would say, with meditation. I'll get into a few of those tonight, I think, still. Jehan's asking if resource fatigue happens with relaxing protocols. Yes, but it looks like rebound. You get rebound protocols if it's relaxing. If it's alpha rewards, theta rewards, you get the reversals, or you get sleep disruptions. Watch for those. That's how you notice it, generally. Ilya, is that Ilya? Yeah, it is. Sorry, the text is very small on that one screen I have your chats on. Any suggestions on how to get access to racetams? I don't know because they've been pretty, more regulated in the past couple of years. There still are some of those nootropic websites out there. I can't really recommend any, but there's a couple of nootropic websites out there that still have some things. But I mean, if I was trying to find racetams, I'd probably go to Reddit and look around and try to get, good vendor vetting. And as some of you guys might know, I helped found a company called True Brain, which is a nootropic sort of drink product that early on, 10 years ago, was trying to create a little consumer-friendly nootropic stack. We quickly took paracetam out of the stack because it was poorly regulated and kind of a gray area compound. And you can buy True Brain on Amazon now because of that. There's not any controlled, or gray market substances in it. But the nootropics landscape, people still miss paracetam because it's such a safe, well-tolerated compound. What I've found, Ilya, is that over the past 20 years, I've been aware of paracetam. There's these cycles where it gets scarce for 5-10 years, and then people realize there's no real black market, there's no real potential for abuse, and then it shows up again in the marketplace for a while. So I would just look around the places that you trust as vendors, those that have third-party certs, those that have good references. I mean, all the same things you would do with any other nootropic strategy is be very careful and know that you're engaging in some risk if you're out there looking for gray market nootropics. I'm not adverse to that strategy, but that's a personal decision and there's some risk there. Let's see. So let me go back to the meditation stuff. Thanks for those questions, guys. It's great. So how long does it take for meditation to change your brain? 20 minutes into our talk tonight. Short answer is not long. Very first session. I mean, it depends on what you mean by change. There's one study that showed, let me see, 2025, in the Proceedings for National Academy of Scientists. This is an MGH, Mass General. Often we do EEG and outside the head, and the MGH group was doing some work with epileptics, and they use, sometimes with epilepsy, use what's called an ECOG, electrocardiogram, which is like a little net, a little Spider-Man net of web of electrodes that you actually put against the cortex under the skull, right up against the brain. And you do this because the grid of electrodes, the cortical electrodes, will allow you to localize seizures before surgery. So you can go in and like find the source of epilepsy and snip it without affecting other things. But often what happens when someone is epileptic and doing monitoring that way is they'll be asked to do other research. And so there was a group of people at MGH who were being essentially prepped for surgery, and so you have to have this electrocardiogram in place for a while, for a day or two at least usually. And during that time, they would do experiments. And one of the experiments these people did was asking them to meditate. And they studied the changes happening in real time using this sort of more medical monitoring, these implanted electrodes, if you will. And so what did they find? A single 10-minute meditation session produced measurable change in deep brain structures, doing localized source analysis, not at the surface, but deep structures, thalamus, hippocampus, amygdala, and cingulates, things with a little bit of EEG and peri-EEG tissues. So we're seeing sensory gatekeeping, memory and learning, emotion, threat, attention control, really interesting stuff, right? So all these regions showed changes in electrical activity. Let me say that again. All of these regions showed changes in their electrical activity during and immediately after a 10-minute session. Single, their first session. And many of these folks were naive to meditation. In fact, some other research later on shows that in some ways, if you're naive to it, you get more change more rapidly in the first session. So it's kind of interesting. But that means that meditation is not exactly like that exercise metaphor, that weightlifting metaphor I was using before, because you're getting effects, state shifts at least, in the first session. It's kind of like, the pump you might get after the gym. If you walk out all swole after your first session in the gym, you might go back a lot more if that was the case, right? So temporary changes, these are functional changes, state shifts, and it would return to baseline. But this proves that even if you're a beginner, you can do something here. You can get something out of it. You're doing something, neurologically meaningful, right? So it's a pretty exciting initial study showing on that time scale, you can get some real good effects. Other time scales to follow, hang in there. Let's see. Radar Ashwood's asking, does True Brain need to be cycled? Probably not, although I often recommend nootropics like 5 and 2, 5 days on, 2 off. And, I also mentioned that I also often don't recommend nootropics. I think it's very, spot filling and gap filling after you've made huge changes is sort of your better strategy there. Meditation, neurofeedback, sleep hacking, methylation, micronutrients, essential nutrients, those can be huge. And then you often don't need nootropics. And if you do, you might think long-term, anti-aging instead of boosting. But people that like boosting, can use the more True Brain style nootropics, and those will do something. And you probably shouldn't take them every day, but I don't know of any harm. Would meditation help epilepsy? Probably not, is my guess, because it does create coherent, slow activity. It might make somebody more prone to seizures. I don't know if that's true. I do know it can affect the ability to shift in and out of deeper sleep and to kind of stick in that hypnagogic state halfway between the two. If you meditate a lot during the day, you might end up stuck a little bit, not sleeping as deeply at night, and that state will make you more vulnerable to seizures often. So my guess is it could. You may want to do more sensory motor things. At that point, I would guess yoga is better than sitting on a cushion, because you're activating the sensory motor rhythm, the tone that inhibits extraneous movement, distractibility, and seizures, and waking up at night when you're not trying to. So sensory motor rhythm or sigma or sleep spindles help with seizure control. They help suppress seizures. They're part of the seizure threshold phenomena that kind of keeps the brain at the edge of criticality. Human brains at this brains in general, mammal brains in general, are this really interesting state where they're kind of always about to have a seizure and they don't. Kind of like falling requires almost, or walking requires almost falling and then not, you know? If we could throw ourselves at the ground and miss, would be flying, right? But in this case, almost having seizures is the stuff of life, the balance between chaos and order. If things were too ordered, too much structure, we wouldn't have life, and too much chaos, we wouldn't have life. So that tension, that balance of criticality is really where thoughts are allowed to happen, and probably where free will lives, consciousness lives. And it's a chaotic place. And because of that, there's this tendency for it to spin out into, you know, more chaos. And sometimes that is a seizure of certain types. So we have mechanisms to suppress that, to keep the brain ordered sufficiently so it can move and not fall down. And sometimes those mechanisms are not well maintained, either in local tissues or more globally, and we get different flavors of seizures. But I would say, you know, you have access to neurofeedback, I believe, radar. So if you're concerned at all about seizures, SMR, baby, and figure out how to do it targeted and to target your seizures, and, you know, do some long-term monitoring, do a 48-hour EEG, make sure you're not seeing the phenomena later on, hopefully not experiencing it for a while. Meditation's fine, but again, I would keep the tissue involved. SMR is also what Dr. Temple Grandin described, the cow squeezing machine that creates deep calmness that she created to help her autistic brain sort of calm deeply in a sensory and executive way. That's SMR. That's sensory motor rhythm. And there's massage, therapeutic massage programs that teach this deep sort of tissue and capsule massage that creates deep stillness, and it's used as a therapeutic rehab in brain injury and developmental difficulties because it's creating that deep stillness. SMR, sensory motor rhythm. I think my first video, one of my first ones on this channel, is about sensory motor rhythm. It's a really important frequency in the brain, and it's the core in some ways of how I think about regulatory stability. So regulatory stability is a big deal in the brain. It's not about being in one mode, it's about balancing between modes. Meditation will help you do that because it helps you develop more space between action and response, a little bit more voluntary, less reactive, more poised over time. But it's not going to make you seizure resistant. It's probably happening at a higher level in terms of time course and tissue organization. So really it's more cognitive control and emotional control, I would guess, you'll build up, not seizure control. I could be wrong. Someone correct me if there's some meditation expert in the channel who knows about this. Radar is asking if I have a meditation routine. I do at times. I'm kind of lax right now. It involves yoga every morning. Ashtanga yoga, generally, where I meditate during it. Other questions. Does FPZ primarily train? FPZ is here. So that's FZ, and that's FPZ, between basically your third eye, FPZ. No. Does it train the anterior cingulate? No. I mean, it could. You'd be more getting into the genu and to more of the underside, even the ventral. There's some evidence I was going to get to later on in this talk that as you meditate, the source of activation goes from anterior, dorsal part of the anterior cingulate, to more ventral. You know, the lack of strong activation means your attention becomes less single and self-pointed, and more into awareness that's less self-centered. So there's neurological evidence that meditation makes you less self-centered. But the cingulate, FPZ, I'm not sure that trains very well, is the short answer. Radar, I think FPZ is often used as a ground historically for a bunch of reasons. There's not a gap there per se, but the signals are not super well resolved at FPZ for some people. It's also a very noisy tissue, unless your eyes are closed. So I would say FZ minus A1, FZ minus PZ, FZ minus CZ. Those are all anterior cingulate, more targeted protocols. Ilya is saying, didn't know that about Temple Grandin. Yeah, isn't that cool? SMR. So interesting considering her work with autism. Indeed. Yeah, she discovered that. She enjoyed being squeezed, I believe. All right, so I mentioned immediate effects in meditation. Those are more transient. When do effects start to stick? Well, in 2010 and 2012, a neuroscientist named Dr. Tang published 2 studies. He took complete beginners and gave them a specific meditation technique called integrative body-mind training, or IBMT. And in the first study, they did 20 minutes of this meditation practice, 20 minutes a day for 5 days straight. That's it. Less than 2 hours total. Brain scans, MRIs afterwards showed changes in white matter in the anterior cingulate, a region crucial for cognitive control, attention stabilization. Those of you who aren't super deep into the neuro yet, as you move toward the front of the brain, you move towards the inside self and the higher level cognitive awareness of things. As you move to the back of the brain, you move towards the outside world. So all the way in the back is where vision is projected onto in some ways. All the way in the front is sort of how you're feeling about things, your cognitive appraisal of approach versus avoid. So you have this sort of like really abstract axis in some ways, where the more frontal areas are self and the more posterior areas are both the body and the outside world. The body is largely considered the outside world in some ways by the brain. But the outside world is also considered the body. You know, tools, when you have a tool that you're used to using, the brain will map it onto the cortex as if it's part of the body, and will have a representation of it that becomes nuanced. So if you've ever done something like become a fencer or a skilled user of a firearm or something, or even like a cook where you're using knives or tools in a very skilled way, you know that when you pick up a tool, it feels different. It feels like it's an extension of your body. And this is because the brain has created a representation. Even an artist with a pencil, the brain creates a representation of it that's very nuanced and specific for that individual. So, meditation must create some sort of representation we don't know as well. But as you do it, we get some changes. So that was 5 days for that first study. 20 minutes, 5 days, less than 2 hours. The second study did 4 weeks, 30 minutes a day. So they got ambitious. 30 minutes is a lot. If you haven't meditated before, 30 minutes is a big ask. I encourage you not to try 30 minutes a day, or not to bother with 30 minutes a day as a goal when you start meditating. Minimal viable practice, whatever is minimal, whatever you can do, and then create part of a self-care ritual and do with repetition. The best exercise is the one you do. The same is true of meditation. So it's not about the best style or amount. It's about the regularity. That's the real takeaway, actually, tonight. But this study, 4 weeks, 30 minutes a day, 11 hours total, roughly. So now the MRI showed increased the corona radiata, the sort of white matter structures that go out and connect parts of the brain broadly, the crown, the radiant crown of white matter tissue that goes into all the individual areas of the brain. This was thicker. Really interesting increased sort of coherence of the tissue in those areas after 1 month. 1 month. Really, really significant white matter changes in this case. Very, very significant finding, and this kind of thing would mean better attention, better emotional control, enhanced cognitive control, less than a month. Now, beginners, when they meditate, we see a lot of activation in the dorsal anterior cingulate. This is the effortful control center. It holds our thoughts in our mind. It selects from competing thoughts. Gets stuck in OCD or songs in our head or biting our nails. It selects the thing without us necessarily wanting to. But very strong activation in these tissues when someone's meditating. I've done a lot of brain mapping on Wim Hof practitioners and teachers. They all have a very strong activation during and right after their Wim Hof experiences, their plunges in the ice. And again, it's a very strong executive control kind of circuit that's kicking into super high gear. And these beginners show a very strong activation in that tissue. Now, that's the learning phase, and this dorsal ACC kicks in almost like training wheels to scaffold and stabilize the attention. But now let's look at Sarah Lazar. Now, she was at Harvard. In 2005, she published one of the first good papers that really put a stake in the ground for, hey, meditation matters. This is the cortical thickness study. Literally thicker in specific regions. It was only 20 practitioners initially, although she's replicated it since. And we had attention, somatosensory, prefrontal, the insula, the auditory, all kinds of cortical areas were thicker. It wasn't just the insula, broad. The insula was the most obvious in terms of a linear change. So, this was really interesting. If you looked at the control group, you can see the very classic association, very strong association where the age equals cortical thinning. But the meditator group, the 20 people that meditated, there was no association of cortical thinning with age. There was some, but it didn't track with their ages anymore. So the 40 to 50-year-olds had PFCs, these areas that were similar to 20, 30-year-olds. Adding 20 years even would be pretty amazing. So imagine adding 20 healthy cognitive years because of increased cortical, health and thickness and processing speed and everything else that comes along with that. Imagine that 20 years to the average person. Again, we're now beyond the general lifespan that we have established, and health will catch up. We'll probably get to 95 or 100 or 120 is my guess. In the next, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we'll probably get above a century pretty reliably is my guess, because we'll fix a few things, we'll solve a few things, not the least of which is access to, care and science. But, we're getting there with some big stuff that are the diseases of aging, some things like cancers and diabetes and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. There's very exciting things happening in all of those big ones. And those are the ones where, from a population development perspective, you have early in population, in economic development, in social development, you have populations that are pyramids with lots of young people and very few old people. And then as populations develop and go from third, second to first world, you have this regularization of the population through deaths stop happening from childbirth or in childhood diseases and start happening for chronic diseases instead. And so everything kind of regularizes out. And then you'll have, big events like the, world wars, where you have, birth booms. The baby boomers, for instance, was that lump that kind of, moved up the column of population as a big, chunk of population. The pig and the python, it's called, the baby boomers. And then my generation, the echo boom, or what are we, millennials? I think so. Latchkey kids who, grew up with rock and roll. That's what we are. Anyways, this population change is about the reason for things, the reason for death changing. It moves from disease and childbirth and other stuff into chronicity, into diseases of aging. And if we're getting our handle on Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, on cancers and diabetes, over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years, if we are able to compress morbidity, to take the disease processes and just knock them back, one of the things for some context is very few of those four, this is not true of diabetes, but in the other ones, in cancers, especially in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, we haven't had a lot of trajectory modifying treatments historically. We've had a fair amount of palliative treatments with varying degrees of success. We've had some symptom modifying treatments in Alzheimer's, some cholinergic drugs, for instance. We haven't had any trajectory modifying drugs for the most part. And we're starting to get a better sense of how, Alzheimer's and even Parkinsonian phenomena, Lewy bodies, these have a metabolic component to them. And we're starting to see how that works. And that's affecting both how we go after interventions as well as how we go after drugs, behavioral interventions and lifestyle interventions, as well as how we create new drugs. So we'll get more control over this stuff over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And what that will look like is compression of morbidity. Alzheimer's starts for, I think, most people on average in the US, when it's symptomatic, moderate to severe, will start usually in your late 60s into early 70s is sort of prime, and then late 70s is when everything peaks for many people. And it often has a 10 or 20 year kind of early, slower incidence. It's often driven by diabetes or other things. So you can sort of see some other, phenomena sometimes. But generally it sort of has this 10 to 15 year kind of ramp up, and then it becomes more symptomatic. And then it's, not too long until what we call terminal drop, which is when a bunch of things sort of erode quickly, often in the last 2 years of life, with a very short drop off in the last few months. So you'll see this phenomena, and it's aging, and these diseases of aging, there's a huge amount of suffering, a huge amount of loss of reserve and ability and capacity of the human to, experience things fully and to have relationships. And so if we can take that stuff and knock it back by 10 or 20 years, if this is part of that, if the meditation is part of that, developing cortical thickness, improving your brain's fat and happy nature. I mean, imagine that. We already have some trajectory modifying treatments out there emerging, and if we can take our resources and push them forward, extend them, not have that drop off in aging by 20 years, well, now we've just kind of reached the sort of foreseeable endpoint for most of us. Now we're like, okay, we're 90 and we're still sharp, and then things fall apart all at once, or maybe we're 100. It's depending on the genetics and luck and lifestyle and a bunch of stuff. So this could be a real factor for somebody who's in their 40s or 50s or 30s, 60s even, who's like, oh, okay, I'm gonna start meditating. You really could potentially lay down more road in front of yourself if you meditate. And I don't think you need to do very much. I mean, my read of most of the studies is that you need somewhere around 20 minutes a day as a long-term practice. I don't think you need a huge amount. And that can be yoga, that can be walking, that can be something, but the way you anchor your attention may matter. So, all right, so Lazar did some more work. Britta, what's her name? Dr. Helzel, I think. They did a longitudinal study, watched people over 28 weeks, and no, sorry, it was a 2-month practice. They did a 28 minute practice for 2 months. So, roughly 2 months. Again, MRIs showing structural changes in the hippocampus, so now involved with memory formation and retrieval. The posterior cingulate now also involved, which is very interesting. The TPJs, which are involved with drinking in the world, and the cerebellum, which is involved with body posture and awareness, and a bunch of other things we're discovering now as well. So this is now posterior parts of the brain that are much more involved. So structural changes in both parts of the brain, white matter and gray matter at this point. So we're getting very, very broad research. Now, there's a little bit of complication here because in 2022, another study was published, a massive study in Science Advances, the largest and sort of the best controlled study thus far, looking at meditation neuroimaging, 218 participants, 2 separate randomized controlled trials, high quality MRIs, and multiple time points. They looked at the exact same stuff that Lazar and the other studies had found, and they didn't find anything. No statistically significant changes after 8 weeks of mindfulness-based stress reduction. Now, MBSR, as an insight tradition, I wonder if the instructions in the earlier studies, were a bit more pointed, or they're more, anchored practices, because MBSR can be very low-key for some people, mindfulness-based stress reduction. MBSR... there are studies showing MBSR creates large changes in things like pain experiences. I think even some cancer outcomes for MBSR. MBSR was, I believe, distilled at UMass UMass Medical in Worcester, Massachusetts by, I think, John Kabat-Zinn was involved in that, and took sort of a Theravada insight style meditation and distilled it out pretty thoroughly into this insight, very Western, very modern kind of mindfulness. When you hear mindfulness, modern mindfulness, it's very secular, very sort of stripped away. It comes from the MBSR stuff in many ways often. And I think for some people you lose. I've seen people do MBSR style instruction and not really get how to meditate or get what it is or do much with it. Like, it can be a very lazy or non-engaged, non-anchored way to meditate for some people. And I wonder if that was part of it. Now, what's going on here? First of all, earlier studies were smaller. Those may have picked up intra-individual differences. That she got lucky and got 20 people, 30 people in the active meditation group that were better at meditating ultimately, or had more change, or had more room to change. So you saw the changes in the MRI. Who knows? That may have washed out in a larger group. And within individuals, those changes were still there for some of the larger study individuals, but wasn't there at a high level, wasn't statistically significant. It was very significant, P of 0.001 and above for what Lazar was finding. So the thing is, structural changes and functional changes also don't always cohere. So in 2 months, you might get functional changes and not true structural changes. It takes 5-6 weeks for neurons to grow and develop. And, a lot of things affect tissue change. So maybe you're getting functional change and not structural. So I would have loved to see things like a quantitative EEG or a SPECT scan or functional MRI, something looking at actual tissue running and having an engine sort of run, because I know I can help people change their brain in a month sometimes, where you see very large changes in the regulatory resting patterns, but you wouldn't necessarily see a lot of tissue change in that time frame. You probably can't, but the brain can change and remodel the tissue and change how it regulates very, very quickly in a single day sometimes. So 8 weeks might not be enough with all of these factors. And there was another metadata analysis by Fox and colleagues that looked at 21 neuroimaging studies. That was in 2014, and found that the most consistent structural differences were in people with years of practice as well. So it could be that Lazar's earlier studies, they got lucky with 2 months again, or if they found people that had a tendency to meditate or some previous experience that they got, didn't get screened out or something. But the Fox group, looking at metadata across 21 studies, found that it was a function of years sometimes. And Lazar's first studies showed that too. The degree of cortical thinning was based on the years or the thousands of hours of meditation was one of the variables. So it's definitely not a thing that happens all at once, these structural and functional changes. So, Buddhist monks, long-term retreat practitioners, etc., had potentially different effects, right? Because if you're training, if you're meditating for a lot longer, well, what happens then? So there was a 2007 study looking at expert meditators, as I said, with chunks of hours, 10,000, 24,000 hours, 44,000 hours as different groups. And this was by, let me see if I can pronounce this person's name, Brefczynski-Lewis. That's one person. I have the link, I believe, in the notes. So this researcher compared novice, intermediate, and advanced, 10,000, 24,000, and 44,000. And they found a U-shaped curve. Novices showed moderate activation and attention. Intermediate, highest activation. And the experts, reduced activation. The brain didn't show as much activation. And we'll see this actually. There's an old study looking at Google use in elders when Google first came out, 15, 20 years ago. They looked at elders that hadn't grown up with computers and how they used Google. Their brains lit up much, much, much more than college students who were familiar with computers, because it was a very taxing task. So familiarity of the task meant you didn't have to recruit as much neural resource load, so to speak. And so this is what we see in this group, in this 2007 study. So is some of that what's happening in these 8-week studies? Are we getting some people that are, in the earlier studies by Lazar, did she get people into an intermediate state in 30 to 60 days? Maybe. And then in this other metadata study, maybe we're getting people beyond that into more advanced states, or maybe some people aren't getting there into the intermediate state yet. So I think there's lots of ideas here about why there's something there, even though it doesn't always come out at a high group level. So very, very interesting. Thousands of hours of practice seem to be creating this shift. Again, dorsal anterior cingulate starts off. It's very, very much I am thinking this right now with this part of the brain in some ways, and there's work looking at, again, thousands of hours of meditators and showing changes. There's work looking at compassion work, loving kindness, compassion kind of meditation. Klimecki did work on that, showing that as you meditate, as you learn to do that work, the source of activation moves from the dorsal anterior cingulate, and it relaxes there, and it goes to more ventral awareness sort of circuits, instead of the strong concentration self circuits. So literally evidence that you become less self-centered as you meditate longer and longer. So the empathy for pain, still there, still see it, but you don't see the sort of self phenomena. You also reduce default mode network, which is really the racetrack of self, of information. So these are phases of skill you can develop over time. All right, so let me go back to questions. Let's see. Radar saying, my friend does 2 9-minute meditation sessions back to back in the morning, says it helps him a lot with productivity. I think it can. That's great. If you're looking for a meditation practice, here's my recommendation if you want one. And again, what works for you and the one you do is the one that matters. But here's what I would recommend. I would do 5 minutes of a single point awareness practice, and then I would do 15 minutes of a present time awareness practice. So you start off by anchoring your attention very narrowly and returning it to the anchor again and again. And then after a few minutes, you shift to watching information flow by and experiences and sensations without attaching to them. So you move from a samatha concentration into a vipassana awareness. If 20 minutes total sounds like too much, cut it in half. Do 2.5 minutes or 3 minutes of single point awareness, and the rest, the balance, 7 minutes or whatever of present time awareness. You can use an app called Insight Timer to set up initial bell, a 3-minute bell, and a 10-minute bell if you want. It's a really efficient way to do it. I think it's a free app still. So, all right. Would it be reasonable? Let's see, who is this? Ilya. Would it be reasonable to see that meditation versed individuals may be better candidates for FPZ protocols, assuming that they have more subtle control of the forehead and ocular muscle tension? I mean, maybe, but you don't have to worry too much about FPZ on the forehead. I mean, here's the thing. Why? Like, what's the rationale? I'm not sure why we would do FPZ necessarily. You know, FZ seems to be pretty good for, or AFZ. Sometimes I'll use AFZ, Ilya. Anterior to FC. So FC is the F line goes here to here. On me, it's about there is the F line. Is that right? Yeah, about there. So the C line, it would be about here. The F line is more out there. The FP line on me is about there. And so that's the AF line right here, basically. So I've used AFZ for a bunch of people, but I've never really used FPZ for training. I don't have a good rationale for it. It's not one of the ones we typically pick up on a QEEG either, so we tend to be biased away from that because in classic recording, it's the ground. You actually use 2 wires above and below FPZ when you place like a mitsar. It's a very classic thing to do anyways. So I don't know. I would need a rationale to be concerned about that for training, Ilya. Yeah, I have good rationales for the midline and the back, but not necessarily for that far forward. Radar is asking, for the Snackers protocol, why is it linked to M2 and not to A2 or to T4? It's a great question. If you find out the answer, let me know. That is not one of mine. There's very few protocols that I promulgate as lore. That's one of them. The FP1 minus M2, low beta reward, theta inhibit, high beta inhibit. Yeah, I'm not sure why. I mean, my guess is it's the insula, right? My guess is we're adding some frontal yoking to insular tissue by getting beneath the surface a little bit of the temporal lobe somehow by going after M2. I don't know if that's true, but we know this is one of the ones that has that effect. There's very few that I use that are lore, but there it is. Can neurofeedback help with anger due to low blood sugar? How so? Maybe. You'll sometimes see people have cortisol phenomena and blood sugar spikes and irritability with PZ alpha speed fluctuations. And if that's happening, you may be able to train for more robust eyes closed alpha. You may find that somebody just has that resistance, that irritability, and you see it when blood sugar goes low. It's not from the PZ cortisol kind of alpha speed thing. It's from, the right front instead often, or the left front, corresponding homotopic areas not being as active. So, maybe it's resistance, maybe it's anger, maybe it's frustration, maybe it's fear. Those can all be different, right? In different locations. Fear can be PZ or, FP2, F8, F4, depending. So think about the approach versus avoid. Think about the posterior cingulate, but also think about the blood sugar regulations with the alpha speed features. Is your alpha speed really slow before you eat, and then it speeds up a lot when you eat by, a hertz or something? That's a sign your blood sugar is a little responsive, or your alpha speed's very responsive to your blood sugar. And I think that's a cortisol kind of fluctuating thing. And so you may want to train some eyes closed alpha. That might help. That'll speed up your alpha a little bit at baseline too. We also know from Gary Schumer's work that will create an immune surge. CD4 plus cells or T cells will get released pretty strongly. Now this is in an immunocompromised population from Gary Schumer's paper, but it is a robust effect. I've seen it in clients as well. Again, immunocompromised clients testing and seeing that there's T cell surges in alpha training at PZ eyes closed alpha. So it's a pretty powerful protocol. Radar is opining, I think you're Gen X, doc. I think I probably am. Yeah, born in the early 70s. Back before the interwebs, I remember the internet coming up right when I was in college. This computer thing, they had this complex word for studying computers, computer and information science, the coins department at UMass Amherst when I was an undergrad. Should have done that. Would have gotten into my geekery a lot sooner with computers. So those are the big features about meditation. Again, the one that seems to work is the one you do, and it ends up being thousands of hours. So what are you doing? What are you doing with that brain? Don't just do something, sit there. Find the way to anchor your attention. And, that can be a bunch of stuff. I'm of the opinion that we get a lot of the same benefits, maybe the same phenomena when we do any contemplative work that is anchored. That means prayer likely fits this category. That means absorbed fitness, sport and exercise might fit this category. I think it depends a lot on the quality of your mind while you're doing it. Is your attention anchored, or are you going through the motions? So I challenge you a little bit to find that thing where you're intentionally picking the way you are anchoring to the moment this week. Find one way that you think you might want to anchor to that might feel good to do, and then try doing that for 5 minutes every morning as a minimal viable practice. Hit the can, brush your teeth, and then go and do the thing for 5 minutes. Maybe it's yoga. Maybe it's sitting and anchoring to some sensation like the sound of traffic going by, or your belly rumbling, or the 5-minute sound of the coffee, water boiling, whatever. Find the 5-minute anchored attention practice. I encourage you, and try it for 7 days. Try it every morning as a minimal viable practice before you drink that coffee, before you eat the food, before you become a slug on the couch. And see how it feels. See if the stability and the quality of your attention builds up over time. I bet it does. We know that one single session does it, and we know that repetitive seems to create more from all of this. So I encourage you to do your own experiments, your N of ones, see how this feels. I've gotten a lot of people to try meditation or yoga, other forms of anchored attention historically, and I've even got people that are phenomenal at meditation to try yoga and discover that it's another form of meditation for them. So, if you haven't gotten into these sort of ways of anchoring yourself to the physical, to the sensory, but not in a cognitive way specifically, more in an embodied way, I encourage you to try it. Very strong, powerful brain resources may be yours for the taking. It does take some practice. So again, don't just do something, sit there. All right, another question here from Ilya. Do you think that training the God spot for theistically inclined individuals could be neurofeedback training target? I don't think the temporal lobe God spot area is well replicated. I think there's been a few case studies here and there, a few individuals, but I don't think it's a button we know how to push. I would encourage you maybe to not worry about, working in that area particularly. Instead, if you want to give people access to those sorts of phenomena, you're probably better off helping them get really well regulated with mood and executive function and stress, and then doing a lot of alpha theta, maybe intrahemispheric alpha theta. There's some early theory books, Julian Jaynes, The Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. What was that? I mentioned the title once before and butchered it. Anyways, this is a book. Let me look it up. Julian Jaynes, yeah. So the origin of consciousness in the breakdown of the bicameral mind. And some of the theories there are that the interhemispheric communication is sort of involved with the perception and experience of thought and complex thought and the tension of thought. Related ideas are that some of the earliest religious writings where we were hearing revelations maybe our non-dominant language hemisphere giving us information for some people that got written down, wisdom, insight, awareness. So I think that if you are able to create more interhemispheric communication, you can support very, very deep experiences for some people. That would be bilateral sum protocols, Elia, sort of alpha theta coherence protocols, basically, or alpha theta synchrony protocols you can do as well. Eager has the coherence modules. We don't use them very much. We often use, sums or duals, which have coherence features, but you can train coherence directly as well. Radar is asking, what's the God spot? Sounds interesting. That sounds like training that would be a recipe for schizophrenia and hallucinations. Hey, good guess. Because what we're talking about are medial temporal lobe features. And if you have dysregulation in medial temporal lobe, you get auditory hallucinations or memories that replay or the ability to close your eyes and see visions, unnecessarily easily. So yeah, I think you're right. Your gut on that, Radar, is really good, that you would probably create a lot of dysregulated phenomena if you were trying to train tonic access in those areas. I think if we do get a better sense of how that area works, those mid-temporal areas, my hunch is we'll be able to trigger those experiences using things like TMS or TDCS that are much more transient, because neurofeedback is likely going to create more tonic shifts over time, and that isn't always something you want to do with tissues. You want to be very gentle and ease in and only move resources in directions that feel good. And I'm not sure that moving into a shamanic ecstatic experience thoroughly would be a good place to push your brain. So be careful, kids. When you're training your brain out there, be careful. If you need to see your own brain, come see me. I'll do a brain map for you. We have them in all of our offices. You can do them remotely as well. You can do full remote programs with us. We're having a Black Friday special pretty soon. But you can get brain maps done in any of our offices for $250 for a membership, which is our current half-price membership. Unlimited for a year. Brain maps galore. Come get lots of brain maps. Look at how your caffeine works. Look at how your fatigue works. Do some neurofeedback if you want, which is an add-on program. You can do those fully remotely. Our coaches are all around the world. We'll send you equipment. We'll teach you to stick wires to your head. I'll help you think about what you might want to train, help guide you as you go. We have a great team, about a dozen people worldwide that are always on a private Slack channel for every client. So if you want to do some neurofeedback, come check out Peak Brain. I think I get linked in the show notes, my consult link, and get in touch with us. We're always around for chatting on the website, as well as, book a call. So I hope you guys are well. We kind of went, it's only an hour. I think I packed a lot into that hour, a lot of meditation-focused work. Minimum effective dose, minimal viable dose is what I'm thinking about for neurofeedback. So for meditation. So why don't you guys get into that? That's your homework for those of you who are regulars. My challenge, my gentle invitation is 5 minutes. Find the 5-minute thing. Think about it today or tomorrow. But by the day after tomorrow, by Wednesday, 5 minutes after your morning ablutions. And let's see if you notice something by next Monday. That's 5 days, right? Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, 6 days. So try that. I encourage you all who are watching this between now and then live, or, if you're watching this later, you too can try the experiment. Try it for a week. See what happens. Check back in the comments. My hunch is you'll notice something, especially if you're new to this. If you're new to the idea of meditation or anchoring your attention or a practice of anchored attention, it does have a pretty significant ability to shift not just our states, but our traits. And, there's an old joke about meditation. When should I meditate? Well, if you have 30 minutes, you do it in the morning. If you have an hour, you do it in the morning and the evening. If you don't have an hour, you must meditate for 2 hours. You don't have to meditate for 2 hours. But the point is that if you don't have time to meditate, you should meditate because it will give you that time. If you're moving more smoothly and shifting your gears through the rest of the day with a different level of control, those 5 minutes, those 10 minutes, those 20 minutes you sat on the cushion and anchored your attention, you will get those back within the same day. So I appreciate it's hard to make the time to sit on that cushion or do the yoga or whatever it is, but that will pay itself back quickly. So I encourage you to invest that small, again, directed amount of attention and observe what happens. Observe how you feel later on that day, the next day, and see if it builds over time. All right, that's the end of my coaching for the night. I hope you found it useful. So a couple more questions here. Meditation is the one biohacking modality I haven't really done, but I should probably try, from Radar Ashwood. There you go, Radar. I hope you found those words inspiring, and anyone else who's watching who's been thinking about meditating, don't just do something. Sit there. Get your butt on that cushion. Do that yoga. It is powerful stuff, the voluntary anchoring of attention. It will create more of you than you have now. So on that note, folks, take care of those brains. I will